business tax? Should Northern Ireland, can Northern Ireland slash its rate to match that in the south? And what's happening with north-south trade? Are people rushing to Newry to grab fat loss drugs? We'll find out why. And what can business do in a world of such uncertainty? That's all in today's episode of Trading Up Unpacked. Hello and welcome to Trading Up Unpacked. I'm Jim Fitzpatrick.
And I'm Richard Ramsey.
This is the business podcast from the Irish News, produced in association with EY, where myself and the good professor from Queen's Business School dig deep into the big business issues of the day. And remember, you can get in touch with us at any time. Email us on tradinguppodcast@gmail.com. Today, Richard, it's all about north and south. And I do want to talk about fat loss drugs. Not because either of us are using them, I don't think. No, definitely not.
No.
Okay, well, that's just a declaration there. We've no interest in this except the fact that this is a fun story. I want to find out about that stampede to Newry for Mounjaro and Ozempic, and maybe if that gives us any hint as to what is happening with north-south trade. We're going to dig into those figures a bit. You've got lots of stuff to tell us about north-south trade. You've been looking at it recently, so we'll have a good rummage around in that, Richard. And I think I also wanted to consider this issue of corporation tax. You'll remember, of course, it was something I suppose we might have been discussing much more maybe a decade ago. But it seems to be back on the agenda, maybe not front and centre, but it's sort of bubbling along there. And I suppose we could dig into that a bit. And I also want you to console us. You know, I know you're not one necessarily for the good news, but I want you to console us, console those in business in an uncertain world. Maybe give us a little bit of advice as to what they can do. So let's start with...
I can only work with the material I'm given.
That's your get out, but I'm going to force you to be positive today. So let's start with the Ozempic rush, the Mounjaro mob heading for Newry. This was a story in the FT. I love it. So basically, there's a boom in the sale of fat loss drugs in Newry. What's happening?
Yeah, so I suppose the thing is we should never doubt the entrepreneurial spirit of people on this island whenever there's a price differential which can be taken advantage of, and that's what's happened with the Mounjaro drug. So the Mounjaro drug... Which is the fat loss drug of choice, I believe, according to the story, for those in the south at the moment. Other brands are available,
yes.
But yes, it seems to be the one which all the rage at the minute. And what was happening was there was a price differential between north and south, and one of the reasons for the differential is in the south, VAT is paid on injectables. Which it isn't paid in the north.
And of course, these drugs,
23%.
tax. These are drugs that, yes, they are injectables. They're not just kind of pills, although I think some of them are trying to develop a pill. But yeah, you do have to inject them. So there's an injectable tax, if you like, in the south, which doesn't apply in the north.
Yeah, and it's the story by Jude Webber in the FT was then looking at where it seems to be even with out the VAT, that the price in the south, the wholesale cost in the south was basically the same as the retail cost in the north. So before you then get stick on a margin, stick on the VAT, and ironically, one of the key active ingredients is actually made in the Republic. So so it's and so what was then happening was then Donald Trump was then saying that he was going to. Something about the prices had to be changed last month, and then so there was a stampede. So everybody was then thinking we've got to get our stock up on this drug because of the savings to be made. And there's people coming from like 90 miles south of Dublin, coming up from the west, from likes of Galway, and it was. In Newry, there was a lot of these pharmacies, and then they had been increasing the number of fridges. They were even hiring additional pharmacists to cope with this demand.
So a quote here from Alan, the manager of McNally's, who asked not to give his full name. So I'm sure nobody knows who you are, Alan, in McNally's in Newry. There's probably lots of Alans there. Anyway, he said, we had a stampede. I had one 6-foot-high industrial medical fridge, and I had to buy 7 others to get the stock in before the price increase. We sold out in a fortnight. So, I mean, it used to be red diesel. Now it's Mounjaro. And and that's all the rage. Basically, people coming up from the south to get it in the north.
Yep, no, that's right, and I suppose it's also then there have been reports that there's something similar in the northwest as well, and then there's even it's not just fat loss jabs. It's also, I think, in the FT story, there was somebody was coming up to get their medication for gout as well. So there's the kind of drugs trade is cross-border drugs trade is really alive and well.
Yeah, it's a different kind of drugs trade. I mean, it's still legal, obviously. So it's not like the cartels have got involved yet. But it is fascinating to see, and it is all about this differential. And the interesting thing we're seeing now, and drug pricing is a political thing, because it's not just we think about the market and people think about the free market as if it is some sort of perfect thing that sets prices based on demand, supply and demand. But obviously, drugs regulated, governments have a huge part to play in how they're regulated and how they're priced. In the south, there's an impact here in this particular case because we're talking about a VAT application, which doesn't apply in the UK. But the wholesale price, as you say, is already a lot higher in the south for some reason. And that may well be to do with how that interacts with the public health system and what price the Republic's government are willing to pay for it on that. Whereas in the UK, we've seen negotiations ongoing between the health secretary and the drugs companies trying to get prices. And we see how that plays in then across the border in the States, where Donald Trump is saying, in general, Europe isn't paying enough to these American drug companies for their drugs, but instead the American drug companies are gouging the US consumers with much higher prices, offsetting the lower price that they're charging in Europe. And he's saying you've got to charge more in Europe. So this is all happening across the board, very, very political.
Trump's version of leveling up.
Yeah, and basically he's threatening higher tariffs if the drug companies in the US don't drop their prices. So it's really hard to track. I don't know if you're any better than me. It's really hard to track exactly what's happening because we don't know whether something is just, a social media post on Truth Social from President Trump, or whether it's actually government policy, or whether it's government policy that's actually been implemented. But one of the things he did say recently in relation to the drug tariffs was 100% tariffs on drugs coming into the country. And we know a lot of those come from the Republic, from the south of Ireland. So a big economic impact there if this takes hold. But he's willing to drop that tariff if there are two potential cases, if they started to build manufacturing plants in the States, but also if they drop their prices for US consumers. So it's really kind of, this isn't the free market we're talking about here. This is kind of real state intervention to kind of impact on prices.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And one of the interesting things is with the stampede north for the fat loss jabs is that we're kind of seeing that appearing in some of the Northern Ireland data in terms of the economic composite index. There's various indices in terms of the service sector, and then there's a retail services index. And one of the strange things is we're having generally the mood in across the economy is that the consumers are cautious and demand is pretty flat. But then if you look at what was happening in the second quarter of this year with the NISRA statistics, was you had a surge in retail sales up 12% year on year, whereas the equivalent figures for Great Britain were pretty much flat. And you're sort of scratching your head as what's going on there. But the pharmacies and chemists are included within the retail sales. So I think one of the things where we're seeing the outperformance in Northern Ireland's figures relative to the rest of the UK is there certainly is a southern comfort from the south, which is kind of boosting the economy and in ways that we maybe haven't seen before.
Yeah, I mean, well, let's maybe go into some of those figures. But yeah, historically, it's interesting to think about the historical shift we've seen then over the last decade or more. So we go back to the financial crisis. And we had the collapse essentially of the Irish banking system, and then obviously the huge difficulties in the UK system, but Ireland itself in a bailout mode. Northern Ireland was swept up in that because of the property crash. And I think you sort of used the term southern discomfort at the time. So we were the economy here dragged down into a deep recession that it had never really experienced before because of the experience in the south. The difference subsequently is that the south's economy has bounced back so strongly. The flows of foreign investment have remained. The tax receipts from those big foreign direct investors have boomed. The Irish government has got a surplus. The Irish consumer, presumably, is feeling rather flush again. And whether it be drugs or maybe other things, they're now maybe spending that money north of the border, and we're benefiting.
Yep. No, absolutely. And the exposure to the financial institutions and banks is that exposure has shrunk. And, in many ways, you've got a number of the banks which were competing on an all-island basis are no longer doing that. And indeed, Ulster Bank was one of them which withdrew from the south. But it wasn't just in terms of in terms of the banking. Of course, it was the whole construction and the housing boom. So you had at a stage when down south they were building, I think it was over 80,000 houses, and you had a lot of manufacturing companies in the north were then building construction materials and building materials for that. And they got swept up in the backwash whenever there was the whole crash, both in terms of global financial crisis and then the kind of property and construction crash in the south.
Hi, listen, I'm just interrupting for a quick minute to thank you for being part of the Trading Up community. It's really appreciated. I think we're building a real community of business and entrepreneurship learning. So remember to hit follow or subscribe. It makes a big difference. And please drop me an email on tradinguppodcast@gmail.com. While I have you, just a quick word about our sponsors, EY. EY is a global leader in assurance, tax, consulting, strategy and transactions, helping clients solve their toughest challenges and seize their biggest opportunities. With teams in 150 countries, EY combines global insight with deep local knowledge to help organisations transform and grow with confidence. Thanks again, and now back to the podcast. And so currently we've got this scenario where there is an economy south of the border which is booming, although has got a lot of uncertainty on the horizon because of what's happening internationally and how that could impact because you take a few of the big payers of corporation tax in the Republic out of the equation, and certain things will look very, very different. But we will get to that. But we have these flows coming north. So can we see, what's happening then in sort of north-south trade, where Northern Ireland is benefiting at the moment? I mean, I suppose we're talking about retail. We can talk about tourism. We can talk about sort of medical procedures. Where are you seeing things happening?
I suppose it's all of those. And then if you sort of think back to then back in 2007, 2009, tourism, because tourism is an export market, so we didn't have the volume of people from the south coming north, and we've seen that improve and increase in recent years. And one of the factors behind that was, again, the differential lockdowns, which were occurring north and south, where whenever there was a lockdown in the south, but not in the north. And we then we saw a few summers ago, there was then all the southern car registrations up along the North Antrim coast. And in many ways, what that was good was that was almost... There were a lot of first-time exporters or first-time tourist visitors, and then they were able to spread the word. And we've then seen how even in the likes of the kind of spa resorts, the various spa resorts, which are now starting to multiply. Again, invariably, when you're up there, I've only been up with a voucher. That you end up you're seeing the kind of southern registration, because not just is it this kind of new product and almost like the new image of Northern Ireland compared to what it was previously, but it's price competitiveness as well. That also spreads into, if we look in terms of health. As well, the kind of health tourism, where we're getting health tourism going across the border in both ways. One of the issues with the health service and the waiting lists people who are maybe unable to get their heart bypass or knee or hip operations done in the north can go south. But then increasingly vice versa, you're having then people coming, particularly for the kind of elective surgery that we're seeing, the Kingsbridge, the Ulster Independent Clinic again. My mum was recently got a knee replacement, and I was going around the Ulster Independent Clinic just looking at the Southern registered cars and stuff, and so that is a feature of a scale that we haven't seen before.
Yeah, but that's a mark of an economist, isn't it? Somebody who sort of scouts the car park for Southern Reg cars.
I think people were thinking I was trying to nick a car, but I was also actually doing that.
But trying to work out what it tells you about cross-border trade. Absolutely. And the same, as you say, Kingsbridge, another big private medical operator here, part of an all-island group as well. Yes, there are buses coming up quite often with patients for particular surgeries. And, it's all big business. And the spending power then of the southern consumer remains strong. Northern Ireland is benefiting from it. I remember kind of joking with somebody after the Brexit vote, and they were saying, well, what's going to happen, to Northern Ireland, what's going to happen along the border? I said, well, it'll probably end up a bit like Tijuana in Mexico, where, the US citizens, and certainly, in years gone by, would have gone across the border to pick up cheap goods, cheap drugs, as we're now seeing. There's an element of that, but
cheap hips and knees.
Cheap hips, knees. It's all there. Can Northern Ireland, survive simply by kind of selling more of this stuff, if you like, to its wealthier southern counterparts?
I suppose it is a market, and whenever you're thinking of trying to boost trade and business, you're trying to maximise your opportunities everywhere. And the all island market has probably been hasn't met its potential. And what you're seeing, because when I was down in Dublin last week at a conference, I met the owner of a PR and marketing firm, and they're actually being charged with working on behalf of one of the private hospitals here in terms of to drum up interest and market the proposition of getting your various elective surgeries done in Belfast.
Yeah, interesting. And that's where we're not get into this because it's a totally different discussion about health. But when you have the private sector can far ahead, in fact, win more business from the south when people who are waiting on the public system are stuck languishing on ever increasing waiting lists. But maybe that's another debate. One thing I suppose that's back on the agenda, I mentioned at the top there, was this thing about corporation tax and business tax. And I want to hear from Chartered Accountants Ireland, who are raising the issue again and asking the politicians to take a look at it. But first, I kind of wanted just to kind of set the context again, because we remember when this first came to the fore. I suppose it always knocked around a bit as something that Northern Ireland's economy could benefit from. The Republic has consistently had a low rate of tax. It initially was a specific tax for manufacturing and from foreign investment. That was then ruled to be against EU rules. So they brought in a tax across all of business, whether you were Indigenous or not. And that was set then at 12.5%. And then, we tended to look south of the border from here, see the investment that was happening from foreign direct investment, think, is there a way that Northern Ireland could match that? So I think it was the Conservative government coming in 2010. Owen Paterson was a big proponent of the idea, and I suppose ideologically they kind of were into the idea. I mean, if we think about it, before I suppose we were dealing with the aftermath of the financial crisis, but there was a kind of agenda there. Even George Osborne at the higher level as Chancellor, he liked the idea of reducing corporation tax. So I think he was favourably disposed to some sort of mechanism here if it helped perhaps drive a conversation about lower corporation tax. That was the context at the time.
Yeah, and George Osborne then he was, I know he's called Slasher Osborne, but he was slasher on the corporation tax as well as on the public spending side. And he wanted to get corporation tax down. There were plans to get it down to 17% by 2020. It only got down as far as 19%. But then
Where's it at the moment again now? We're back up to
25.
25, yeah, so it's a big jump, yeah.
Yeah. So, and it was in the wake of Brexit in July 2016. He was then, I suppose he was maybe trying to hold on to his job at that stage, which he then subsequently lost. But he was then talking about in July of 2016 of lowering it below 15%. So it was getting within very close to the 12.5% in the south. And why that at that time fueled the whole corporation tax debate and harmonising it kind of north and south was the fact that the cost of it, because it was then going to be that Northern Ireland through its block grant would then have to fund whatever the difference was. Whenever it got down to, you were getting it down to if it was going to be 15% or lower, you're talking about just funding a 2.5% cut, whereas now it's then just back up to 25%. So what you have seen is the actual cost of delivering the corporation tax is now kind of double, or even more than double what it was previously at the time.
Yeah, so actually, we'll talk a little bit more about that cost and how things have shifted, but that's a very, very important distinction between where we're at now and where we might have been, as you say, the trajectory post-Brexit and where Osborne wanted to take things, and how that formula might work. We do know that the low rate has been hugely successful in the Republic in attracting the large scale, foreign direct investment. And the theory, I suppose, is that Northern Ireland could emulate that success. We said that the Conservatives were in favour of something in principle. Owen Paterson was a big champion of it when he was Secretary of State here. And they tried to come up with this formula that would have compensated the Treasury for monies lost in the short term, but then the belief being that at some point the whole thing would be revenue positive. So let's hear from the accountants, and this is from Mark Lawther and Crona Cloisy, who have been doing a lot of work on this on behalf of Chartered Accountants Ireland. I caught up with them both recently, just round at EY's headquarters in Belfast, and I began by asking Mark what it was they were actually asking for.
So we're asking that we restart the debate over the introduction of a special lower corporation tax rate for Northern Ireland. This debate started quite a number of years ago, and as Chartered Accountants Ireland, we were part of that debate. 2015, the legislation was brought in to enable this, but as yet that has been untested as a way of boosting the economic activity of Northern Ireland. We've seen that there is benefits elsewhere from other jurisdictions, and really we want to restart that conversation because the reasons and rationale for that are as relevant today as they were 10 years ago.
So how would it work in practice? Because before, one of the big stumbling points was the price that Stormont would have to pay to do this, the compensation, if you like, it would have to pay to central government. How would it work in practice?
And that conversation is as relevant today in the current economic climate. We recognise that with the way that the Barnett consequentials work, there will be an impact on that. But our argument would be that there should be engagement with the Treasury to bring in a low rate loan for the Northern Ireland economy that allows that to be replaced any impact on the block grants. It's not just us that has been calling for that. That was part of the Independent Fiscal Commission's recommendations back in 2022. And we think that is the best way to mitigate any impact, because there will be a natural impact. But we have to remember that it is not going to be just the impact of a reduced rate of corporation tax. Bringing more activity in Northern Ireland will drive revenues from PAYE, VAT, and hopefully the whole economic benefit. We don't see this as a silver bullet. This is part of a wide range of economic policies that should be put in place to really help Northern Ireland to continue to grow for the long term.
There was legislation put in place back in 2015 to do this. It has just never been enacted. And we believe in order to stimulate economic activity, further economic activity, entice businesses to come to the region, corporation tax can be used as one of those levers to do that. Northern Ireland has one of the most unique positions in the world whereby it's able to benefit from EU access for goods pretty easily. And there's no other country in the world that has that sitting outside the EU. But we haven't seen the FDI that was, I won't say promised, but expected to come from that. And I suppose now is the time really to examine why that is. So corporation tax is just one of those measures. You need an ecosystem of a good supply of labour, a skilled workforce, infrastructure, lots and lots of things go into making up a really good FDI model. And why not put corporation tax into the mix?
So Crona there from Chartered Accountants Ireland, and Mark just before setting the case out there, saying that it's legislation was put in place in 2015 that made this potentially something that could happen, but it has never been fully explored. But there is, and we sort of touched on it beforehand, and we'll get into it now a bit more, there is the need to compensate the Treasury. If Northern Ireland had a different rate of corporation tax, a lower rate of business tax, basically the Treasury, the UK government, would lose money because there would be less money being taken in tax from the companies here, and the Northern Ireland executive would have to compensate the central government from its budget. The argument is that over time, if you do the formula correctly and keep an eye on things, and they mentioned a couple of things there, whether it be increased investments, you have new jobs, you have more people paying tax on their income, you have more people spending money, so there's bigger VAT returns, and you bring more companies in, and then so overall you have more business tax being collected potentially, that it all works out net positive. But it is complicated, and I think the key point that you've identified, Richard, is that the difference, that you have to compensate for is not between, say, a rate of 12.5% and 17%. It's going to be between 12.5% and 25%. So it becomes potentially much more expensive. But if I'm saying to you, look, here we are. This is a great idea. We need to put the rockets under the economy here. Don't be so negative. What would you say? You would say, it's my natural instinct, I can't stop it.
I suppose I would have been for trying to cut the corporation tax previously, and part of my kind of rationale as well would have been to improve the business environment. But in order to do that, you would have had to have then sacrificed on the altar some of the existing sort of benefits for the business, whether it's like manufacturing derating, whether it's all the various kind of reliefs and things, even Invest NI's a lot of its budget. You would have been using a lot of that to fund that. But it was mentioned in that clip about in 2015, it's as relevant today as it was then. I would disagree with that. If we even think now, we've got unemployment, record lows, 2.2%. Employment and getting jobs isn't an issue, which was kind of what the FDI or what the corporation tax was about, partly, but it was also about getting high quality jobs, and then in terms of FDI as well. But if you look at what's happening with FDI, you just look at what's happening globally at the minute. So the kind of global world order for the last 80 years is being dismantled. So in the process of dismantling, so one of our kind of flagship FDI companies at the minute is currently, because of Trump's tariffs, is going to lose one of the products that it produces here, which is then going to go back to the US.
Which company are we talking about now?
I don't actually. The name wasn't revealed. I can maybe
you
suspect
speculate.
It was in the Northwest. But so the thing is, no matter what corporation tax is there, that's not going to do anything for that company. And I just sort of feel as well. I think we've missed the boat with the lower corporation tax because the world has changed, the global environment has changed, the level of uncertainty is such that to try and convince an FDI firm to come into Northern Ireland here with potentially with the corporation tax rate, there's a whole host of other issues which, in terms of uncertainty, tariffs, what Trump is or isn't going to do, which just means sort of like they would say, that's a great idea for the future, but not for now. But primarily, I think the whole where it's going to run into trouble is then just in terms of funding it, because at ballpark figures, it'll be probably 850 million.
You don't find that down the back of the sofa, do you?
No, and a couple of weeks ago we were then talking about the fiscal woes of kind of Stormont and the difficulties that they have. And originally, whenever the legislation was devolved down to Stormont for the lower corporation tax rate, it was up to Stormont to demonstrate a period, which would have been several years of fiscal stability. It hasn't demonstrated that. We know all the problems with water charges, no funding for that. And there's currently several hundred millions of pounds short of what is required. So if you were then to load this in now, even if it was, you got all the business community on board, would you get the MLAs? Would they think from a social perspective, how are we going to fund this? Are we going to cut health? Are we going to cut education?
All right. Yeah, I mean, I see your point that there are all sorts of reasons, and let's face it, our local politicians haven't really got a reputation for taking tough decisions or swift decisions, that have a strategic impact. But let's just sort of kind of look at the principle of it again, because why potentially, it's a good thing, or something of that scale and magnitude, perhaps. And I remember having a chat many years ago with a person who was actually the chair of the IDA in the South. And what I found really interesting was that he explained that the role of the IDA, which I think of as the IDB and now Invest NI equivalent in the North, was quite different. It was a semi-state industry, and that was set up with a specific remit that covered not just implementation, but policy itself. Mm-hmm. So, in a sense, you could look at the Irish experience, since post-war, or even since the 60s, when they started to look outwards with their economy as essentially one government. It hasn't really changed that much in terms of how they've thought about things. And so they set up these semi-state industries. And they said, you can come up with the policy as well as the implementation of it, and you can tell us politicians what it is we should be doing. So whenever the Irish ran into trouble with their special tax rate to attract foreign direct investment, and whenever Europe said, look, this isn't equitable, it has to be across the board, rather than giving up on that strategy, the IDA had already been working on it, and they came back to the politicians and said, look, guys, what you need to do is make it 12.5% for everybody. That's it. They told them what to do, and the politicians followed suit. So they've had this kind of consistency of policy. Yeah. They've had agencies like that can work, sort of very adept at kind of working out what it is that business needs and wants and telling the politicians what to do. And they've come up with kind of bold things like that. And we've seen an element of that as well in the aftermath of the financial crisis, when, as Ireland was bankrupt, it was part of a bailout program. Who could have expected it to bounce back in the way it did? But it came up with using its soft power in that case with things like the Global Irish Network to bring the Irish diaspora in and not just kind of give them a good time, but talk to all these kind of leaders and big companies across Fortune 500 companies and actually say to them, what is it you think we should do? Ask them for their advice and then implement it as part of their recovery plan. So that's kind of how things have operated in the South. And I suppose what I'm saying is, shouldn't we try and copy them just a little bit, and maybe we would be in a budget surplus situation rather than a budget deficit?
I suppose it's costs one thing, benefits are another. And I am less convinced of that the benefits of having the lower corporation tax would be as good as they looked 10 years ago when this was being looked at. And even in terms of chatting amongst like the business community, the kind of view is it's strong support in some quarters, but in other quarters there's almost like there's a feeling, well, if we couldn't get it delivered and across the line when everybody every man and his dog and MLA was behind it. We couldn't get it across the line now. There's more uncertainty and more difficulties, and funding it is even more costly and more difficult to fund than ever before. How are we going to do that? And what you hear amongst a lot of the business community is in terms of the lack of skills, lack of skilled workers, to a degree that we didn't hear before. So if you were to bring a huge amount of FDI, could you actually, we're going to get the likes of Bank of America coming with another 1,000 jobs. One of the key things I would be thinking for there is, where are you going to house the workforce and their ambition for individuals to want to have a house, have a home, and all of that sort of thing, whenever we've got all the problems with housing, which is linked to wastewater infrastructure. So we're kind of, in many ways, we haven't got the infrastructure to deliver on if we did do the corporation tax rate, and if it did pull in all the investment that the key proponents would say it would.
Yeah.
I'd say we wouldn't be able to deliver on that. So my view would almost be the kind of, we need to get the infrastructure, the housing, the wastewater infrastructure. You need to get that sorted first, and then you would need to be looking at that further down the line. But
yeah, I suppose that's kind of something where I think we can see parallels, north and south, where neither jurisdiction has done particularly well on that whole sort of infrastructure piece. People wouldn't be aware of. Again, funny enough, I remember writing a story when I was last working at the Irish News as a junior reporter on business, or as a business reporter, many years ago. I remember writing a story about how the investment in the roads in the Republic would soon mean that roads in the south of Ireland would be better than roads in the north of Ireland. And this was coming from, I think it was maybe the CBI, or somebody had observed what was going into investment in roads there and made this comment. This was political dynamite to actually say that at the time. I remember it was an issue of discussion on Talkback on the BBC, because people couldn't believe the idea that the south of Ireland could at some point have roads that were better than Northern Ireland. Well, we know now that they do, and they've motorways going the length and breadth of the country. That's infrastructure where we can see that they made the right decisions at the right times and they got things done. But there's been all sorts of things that they haven't done on housing, and they haven't invested enough in their energy infrastructure. And so now they're losing investment where they need it, and things like data centers. They haven't perhaps invested enough in the whole renewables side of things either, where there were opportunities there. And indeed, they're stymied on housing development, the same as in the north, and water infrastructure here, huge problem, an issue in the south as well. So, perhaps I've just said, I'm contradicting myself here when I was saying, they've shown imagination, they've shown that they're adept in certain policy areas, but there's a danger where they could end up being a one-trick pony as well.
Yeah, but education was also where the South then, in terms of investing in education, in terms of the FE colleges, which was then an area that has been grossly neglected in the North, and that was a slow burn of decades of investment, which they then reaped that with the lower corporation tax.
So they had, yes, and the other thing is they had a youngish population at the time, so they had a lot of people coming out of these, educational colleges with the right sort of qualifications to supply the industries that they were attracted in with the lower tax rate. And I suppose what you're saying is here we're not really geared up for that here.
And it's even absolutely, and it's another thing is, in the south as well, the southern government don't want the corporation tax issue to be kind of raised, or the kind of PR from it, because Mr. Trump is just keeping his eye on what's happening in Ireland, and he just sees anything which is then trying to bring investment to this island in terms of new attractive incentives or taxes. He's dead against that. So you would have to do it under stealth, which is difficult to then attract to attract firms over. It's
a huge problem. Yeah, I mean, because the foreign direct investment, we've come through this world, of the sort of transnationals, the big global corporations investing wherever best suits their needs, to now emerging into a very different world of protectionism And the idea of foreign direct investment, if you're an American company, can be toxic because Trump is, as you say, he's looking to see where are you putting your money, and if you're not putting it in the US, I don't like it.
And he's come out again recently, again in terms of he wants to make the Hollywood film industry great again, and it's the idea of having tariffs of 100% tariffs on any films made outside the US, and Ireland has benefited hugely, both north and south, in terms of film production and all of that sort of thing. So all of these things and all these uncertainties of, is he going to hit a tariff, yes or no? And then with that uncertainty, it's like a 3D chess game is being played. And then if you were then to add in another complication of corporation tax, many business people's heads would just totally melt at the prospect and just can't compute, and there's too much stuff going on.
Yes, well that's true, isn't it? I mean, there really is like that. You just, as I say, it's almost impossible to follow what's happening. And like, I know, let's take our own situation here of the Northern Ireland Protocol, the Windsor Framework, and how that applies to trade in and out of Northern Ireland. It's pretty well settled, except little changes around the margins that are ongoing. And yet, I know from talking to people in business, whether the businesses here are pretty well up to speed on it, but when they're trying to do business with other locations, they just it sort of melts their head, the idea that Northern Ireland could be part of the single market, but remain part of the UK market as well. And that's just one little example of where those complications need constant re-explanation to people. I mean, I'll give you one example, and this maybe is no surprise that this was confusing, but I was doing a TV program for the BBC for Spotlight. I was flying off to film in Montenegro, but I was staying in Croatia, and we were flying out of Dublin, right? And we had to take a lot of kit with us. Now, if you're flying into another part of the EU from the EU, that's not an issue. You just bring your camera equipment with you, no problem whatsoever. But if you're flying from the EU and going into another jurisdiction outside of the EU, then you need all sorts of customs paperwork. You need a carnet, and you need everything itemized on your carnet, from not just your cameras, but everything right down to every last tie clip and battery. So it's a complicated process. The BBC have an office that prepares all this paperwork, and then when you arrive at the customs post, you hand over your paperwork and they check through things, and then you go to the one on the other side of the border and they check it, and then you go on through. So we were staying in I've lost myself here almost. Never mind the audience. So let me explain. So we're staying in Croatia, right? We're flown in from Dublin to Croatia, EU to EU, right? So far, so good. We don't need the paperwork. But we're going into Montenegro to do some filming. That's where we need our paperwork, right? So we arrive at the first customs post, which is on the Croatian side, with our nice, shiny carnet to say, look at us. We've got all our paperwork ready to go. We're going in here for the day. Here's our paperwork. You have a look at it. Then we'll drive down the road. We'll show the guy in Montenegro and all will be good. First problem, first checkpoint. Why have you landed in Croatia from GB with out a carnet to get into Croatia? And then, so with someone who didn't speak that much English, and I can tell you my Croatian isn't brilliant either, trying to explain that, no, but I'm part of the Northern Ireland Protocol and the Windsor Framework, and hence we were travelling from one EU sort of single market to another, and therefore we didn't need the carnet, but we did need it now in order. Anyway, you can imagine that this conversation took a while until they eventually got bored and let us go through. That was just one small example. There was nothing wrong with our paperwork, but the problem there was he didn't understand what was happening. So
closer to home, I had a similar one. I was ordering up a orthopedic dog bed,
right,
for my arthritic Labrador, and it was about 5 weeks, and there was still nothing. And then I rang up the company, and I think it was near Liverpool or somewhere, and spoke to the lady owner, and she was saying, "Oh, it's all about." She talked about Windsor Framework and all difficulties, and she said, "Just to be honest, when we see an order and we see it's from Northern Ireland, we go, oh shit, Northern Ireland." And I eventually got it, but it's those are the
yeah, because people just couldn't be bothered dealing with the hassle or dealing with that uncertainty. So anyway, long story to make, I suppose, a big point. Uncertainty multiplied at the moment, uncertainty squared because of, all the changes with tariffs, what's happening day to day. You have to basically keep a rolling, kind of spreadsheet tracker of Donald Trump's tweets and how those compute with US government policy. What is that actually doing to investment? What is that doing to trade across the world? Is that actually having a real impact as we speak, regardless of what's happening to prices in the US?
Well, you're starting to see some like U.S. manufacturing activity has been falling in recent months. I think we're still waiting for the tariff hit to come in terms of the U.S., where that's the expectation is that that's not, in the coming months, we're now going to start to see more of that, and that's going to impact on trade. I know then even in terms of the construction industry, the global construction industry, there was a report out by Curry and Brown, which was then talking about uncertainty has cost $2.5 trillion.
Sorry, $2.5 trillion.
A lot of zeros, and that's equivalent of Italian GDP, and that was like a survey. We're looking at 1,000 odd construction companies which are having a $2 billion hit in terms of its uncertainty. So it's whether it's things like postponements, delays, work getting rescoped, which was a word I hadn't heard before.
It's important to know the lingo, yeah.
Yeah. So, and it was then just added up that all of it was then something like 13.7% of all of the construction projects across this panel of 1,000 firms has been cancelled or delayed, and that equates to $2.5 trillion. So it's
$2.5 trillion. I mean, let's just think about that for a second. They have computed. That's not like this is potential cost. This is what they think has been taken out of hasn't money that's disappeared.
Yes.
And that's, if you're saying that's the equivalent of the Italian GDP. Italy is what? It's a top 10 global economy. So you're just taking that economy out of the equation. In the global scheme of things, I mean, that you feel that's noticeable.
Yeah. So, and in many ways, we had the whole kind of phony war of the tariffs until kind of now, where it is then going to impact and sort of bite, and then particularly in the US, like the farmers, who export the soybeans, and the fact that China, which was its biggest market, isn't buying. It's causing sort of problems there. So we're going to see these kind of things back up, and in many ways, some of the prices as well, the price pressures. Up until now, you've seen firms, have maybe been taking the hit, whereas they're now going to put it onto the consumer. And it's a bit like they're kind of trying to get sauce out of a ketchup bottle at the start. It's sort of nothing seems to happen, but we're waiting for that
suddenly
potentially that kind of splurge.
Well, a splurge of ketchup all over the plate very soon is what you're saying. I suppose we have seen indications
and I'm
of
wearing
it.
A white shirt.
We have seen indications with some of the prices in the States now starting to creep up. I think in certain sectors. So that's certainly where you'll see it hitting inflation. But I think the uncertainty piece is interesting to consider because, it is. If you take your orthopedic dog bed and the business that ultimately just couldn't be bothered, but has been persuaded because you've gone the extra mile to get that, but all the other opportunities where they couldn't be bothered selling that bed because it's Northern Ireland, too much hassle, multiply that X million times across the world where people are thinking, can't be bothered interacting with the US market at the moment, or I don't know what's happening with this market here. I'm just going to go and do business elsewhere, or keep the head down, or not spend my money, or keep it in the bank. That's what we're talking about. That's where this uncertainty index has a real impact. And we're seeing that. So I said I was going to try and force you to be kind of positive.
I suppose if you were forcing me to be positive, but what I would say, and what I was actually saying at Intertrade Ireland Trade Conference last week in Dublin, was the kind of extra trade Ireland environment is where there's more uncertainty than there is in the Intertrade Ireland environment. And, because there's Trump, whatever he has with the trade deals, which are trade deals, they're not like we all know what trade deals like in terms of Brexit and winter framework. They took years of negotiation, not something which is a deal done with Trump over a weekend and it's a few sheets of paper and he can rip it up at a moment's notice if he gets out of bed at the
on the wrong
side. Although he doesn't, with his tweeting, he doesn't seem to get into bed. But so there's more uncertainty in the global sphere because the whole world and all the kind of global institutions, even Trump's challenging the Federal Reserve, its independence. He's challenging everything. But actually, you have the institutions on the island of Ireland aren't being challenged. You have trade deals which have been firmly established. We had a lot of the Brexit pain over the last number of years, but it's now kind of known. And so if you're a first-time exporter on the island of Ireland, don't be put off by all the kind of tariffs and everything that's going on. There's not, we're not having Dublin throwing tariffs at Stormont and vice versa. We have stability there. So I suppose that's the positivity, and we need to be more a bit like the consumers who are heading across to arbitrage on how cheap the fat loss jobs are up north. It's what are those opportunities for businesses on both sides of the border where they can get a new supplier, purchase equipment from somewhere else, or
yeah, so the trade, in a sense, it starts closer to home. Don't worry too much about the global machinations. There's always business to be found.
Trade's like water; it'll always find a way.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it is fun actually to think about the historical context, just to divert for a second. Because I remember looking at this when I was studying the whole Brexit issue, and I was looking for archive pictures, and you get these archive pictures of the border in Ireland and customs officials with big moustaches and standing there in black and white pate newsreels. But actually, it was the Free State government in the south which kind of initiated the trade war at that time, north and south. And the reason they did it was because essentially the Free State was largely broke, and it needed to find a way of raising money. So the funny thing is, and everybody realized after a number of years of kind of grinding poverty that this wasn't a great way to grow the economy, but we're now back globally with Donald Trump has got a mindset that goes back to that idea that we can use tariffs to raise money. The longer term implications for the economy aren't likely to be great. He's
going to put on those long coats and dodgy moustaches.
Well, that's kind of what he's doing, isn't he? I mean, in the short term now, we are seeing the U.S. Treasury is obviously getting money from its tariffs. But anyway, let's just think about the canny consumer then, and how they perhaps point the way for our businesses here. So we have talked about the Manjaro stampede to Newry.
Or it was when IKEA came to Dublin, there was buses put on. So it's just how the consumer can always seems to find a way.
Yeah, and as you say, like water, the consumer kind of sniffs it out, spots the opportunity, goes and gets the best price or whatever it is. And for businesses then, there is that opportunity, north and south, to do that trade. And when we think about the fundamentals as well, although there is this huge uncertainty at the global level, the Republic's government has had a huge budget surplus. Although there are issues with, obviously housing shortages that we hear about, and, perhaps the cost of living, the savings index has been going up across the world, north and south, I think in the UK and in Ireland. So it means that people are sitting there with, probably quite a lot of money in the bank on average. I'm saying not everybody, obviously, but on average than they would have done, maybe going back to the financial crisis in 2008. So there's money there to be spent in the local economy if businesses can work out how to get it out of people's pockets.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not just, we often think of trade as just trading goods. Remember, it is services as well, which the likes of what we're talking about in health, everything from corrective eye surgery or your health issues, all of that kind of stuff that's a kind of booming market. And the fact that one of the private hospitals was recently sold is, probably testament to the opportunities for growth. And that's growth on the island of Ireland. It's not growth that trying to look for people coming over from GB to avail of private health here. It is coming from the island.
Yeah. Okay. Well, look, we'll leave them then with that positive thought. There is money to be made if you can just.
We're an oasis of calm relative to the chaos.
Yeah,
Trump
exactly.
of just chaos. in Extra Trade Ireland world.
Yeah, just to switch off the old Twitter, X, don't have too much social media. Give yourself some headspace, focus on what it is you do well, and you can keep rolling along. Richard, thanks a million for joining us. Thanks to you for joining us again on Trading Up, which is all about, I suppose, learning from other people in business, digging into the big business issues on Unpacked. And remember, you can get in contact with us at any time on tradinguppodcast@gmail.com. And please do hit follow or subscribe. It really helps, and we appreciate it. And this podcast is produced in association with EY. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you again soon.